Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Katrina Manigan. I lead the Buildings and Homes team in Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. And today we're going to brief you on the work of the Energize Denver Task Force. And we will aim to make this a less technical briefing than the one we did last week. But we did want to run through the same slides so that you get the same information, but we just may not go as deep on all of them. But if you have questions, do feel free to chat with us. The chat function is enabled for you to chat just with us as panelists. You can also use the Q&A function. So we'll be watching both of those spaces and we'll try to answer any questions that you have. All the slides are posted on the website right now. And we'd encourage you to use the chat and the Q&A function for clarifying questions and to put your thoughts about the task force's work into the task force survey. So Jan Kelleher, who is here and who will be presenting part of the briefing, will put the link both to the community engagement website where all these slides are posted, as well as the survey that we want you to take into the chat. We'll do that a few times just to make sure we catch everyone, because if someone joins after it's posted in the chat, I don't think they can see it. So we'll keep posting that survey in the chat. Feel free to keep the survey open. There's some long field answers where you can add your comments as we go. And so with that, let's go ahead and dive in. We'll spend about 20 minutes giving you some background on climate efforts in buildings. And then we'll turn to the Energize Denver Task Force's work. I believe we have 2 task force members here with us. So we'll let them comment a little bit as we get into that Energize Denver Task Force portion of the briefing about what has really stood out to them in the task force process. So look forward to that, and we will then get into sort of a detailed briefing on where the task force is at with their work. So a little bit of background on climate effort in buildings so that you have context for where the Energize Denver Task Force fits within that, in the policies that they're recommending for the existing commercial and multifamily buildings. Okay, so first, commercial and multifamily buildings account for 49% of Denver's greenhouse gas emissions. That is 3,000 large buildings over 25,000 square feet and 14,000 smaller buildings that are under 25,000 square feet. We do work as a team. In blue is work that's complete, green is work that's in progress. We do work as a team in both new buildings, which is what you see above the line, as well as in existing buildings. We're going to be focusing on the existing building work today. The Denver Climate Action Task Force met last year and really laid out some ambitious goals for the city on both new buildings reaching net zero energy by 2030 and existing buildings reaching net zero energy by 2040. And so for new buildings, we wrote a plan for how to get there and are going through a code adoption process this year. For existing buildings, you'll hear about the strategic existing building electrification plan here in the sort of background slides. That's actually complete. And then the Energize Denver Task Force is really looking at how we can get to that goal through policy. A little bit of background just on what have we done in the past. We now have 5 years of benchmarking data. Benchmarking is the process of measuring a building's energy performance, similar to a miles per gallon rating on a car, but it's a 1 to 100 Energy Star score, where 50 is the national average. And you can see all of these scores and all of the energy use per square foot of buildings at energizedenver.org. We also have the Green Buildings Ordinance in place, which covers existing buildings at the time of roof replacement. And so at the time of roof replacement, they have to take one of the actions that you see listed here: adding a green roof or green space, adding solar, doing energy efficiency. So there is sort of this smaller requirement for existing buildings in place today. We have also I'll mention other programming. We do case studies. We give Energize Denver awards. The nominations, I think, actually have just closed. So they're not open. I believe they're not open anymore, but we'll be announcing the winners this fall. They were open still last week when we did this briefing. There's financing available to pay for improvements. Denver is enrolled in the state or is a participant in the statewide PACE program. I wanted to share how are we doing on our goals today. So we have a goal to save 30% by 2030 in building energy use. And that's in our 80 by 50 climate action plan. And today, our current trajectory is that we're actually increasing energy use in buildings every year. This is largely driven by the addition of new buildings to the city, but existing buildings still aren't on the goal trajectory. They are getting slightly more efficient every year, but because we're also adding buildings to the city, the total trajectory is going up. And this is what we're trying to change, both with the work in code and with this Energize Denver Task Force policy for existing buildings. The Climate Action Task Force met in 2020 and made a whole series of recommendations to the city. Broadly, they said as a city, we need to be at net zero energy by 2040, and that then includes buildings. They had the top policy for buildings or recommendation for buildings to implement a building performance policy that includes strategic electrification of all existing buildings and homes to achieve net zero energy by 2040, and to equitably enhance affordable housing through incentives and low income programs. I don't want to go through every detail on this slide, but they got pretty detailed in terms of the goals they laid out for the city. And they said by 2025, I'll note that we should have requirements for electrification at the time of replacing heating equipment and no new natural gas equipment for commercial and multifamily buildings. They did have recommendations for homes. Some of those are mentioned here, but I'm really going to focus on the building recommendations because that is the focus of the Energize Denver Task Force. We are not talking about homes. They said by 2030, similar to our 80 by 50 climate action plan, buildings need to use 30% less energy. And half of the buildings should have zero heating emissions because they have been electrified. And then by 2040, they said by 100% of buildings need to have zero heating emissions, and that we need to have them at net zero energy using 50% less energy. The Climate Action Task Force also recommended that City Council refer a ballot initiative to the ballot it's named 2A. It was approved on the ballot with nearly 65% of the vote, instituting a 0.25% sales tax that started on January 1st of this year to provide our office with up to $40 million in funding annually. And so one of the things the Energize Denver Task Force is looking at is some recommendations around how to spend some of this funding to support the policies that they're recommending. So when you get to their recommendations, it is towards the end, but wait and look for like all of the supports and incentives that they're recommending to go with the policy recommendations. So with that, I want to pass the background part of the briefing to Jan Kelleher to tell you about the renewable heating and cooling plan.
Thanks, Katrina. Hi, everyone. My name is Jan Kelleher. I'm the building electrification lead for the city and county of Denver. I'll just give a brief overview of our renewable heating and cooling plan, which was published this past summer in June. And next slide, please, Katrina. A little bit of what's in the plan. First and foremost, there was a lot of community engagement. We engaged over 300 stakeholders, including 50 phone calls with low and medium income households, surveys, conversations with contractors, workforce roundtables, as well as roundtables with property managers, building owners, and building engineers. Next, we dive into sort of why renewable heating and cooling and what's the case for it. How does it benefit Denver residents in terms of not only reducing emissions, but also improving air quality, as well as increasing access to cooling and a number of other co-benefits. Then we have a comprehensive grid analysis. So we worked with Excel Energy on this to understand what are the impacts of electrifying buildings on the grid. And our findings are largely that we have quite a bit of headroom to electrify wintertime gas uses. Then we dive into the conversion plan for major heating systems. So we identified what are the most common types of heating systems in Denver for space and water heating. What are the best ways to electrify those? And what are the cost implications, both the capital cost and operating cost implications? And then finally, we have a number of strategies that the city is intending to focus on to understand, what are some of the, how do we move the needle on renewable heating and cooling around community engagement, additional education and communication in this space, as well as policies and programs and incentives that the city should put in place to advance electrification. Next slide, please. One of the findings in our analysis is that in commercial and residential buildings in Denver, 97% of gas use is just for two end uses, and that's space and water heating. 3% of gas use is kind of like miscellaneous gas uses like cooking, clothes drying, pool heating, etc. So what you'll find is not only the plan, but also a lot of the policy work that Katrina will outline is exclusively focused on space and water heating and addressing just those two end uses as the biggest driver of greenhouse gas emissions from gas use in Denver. Next slide, please. One of the findings of the plan is also how much of a high impact climate benefit electrification is to Denver. One of the benefits we have here in Denver is that Excel Energy is very quickly decarbonizing their electric grid. So while today it's already around 30% renewable, by 2030 it's going to be 80% renewable. So a heat pump installed today is going to be operating on a largely or even exclusively renewable grid within its lifetime. And Denver actually has a goal of further advancing the decarbonization timeline for the grid. We would like to be at 100% renewable by 2030. Also, to keep in mind, it's important to keep in mind that the primary component of natural gas is actually methane, and it's about 80 times more potent than standard carbon dioxide emissions. So any fugitive emissions of methane in the entire supply chain are really have an outsized negative impact on climate change. Next slide, please. By and large, what we're talking about for these systems are heat pump-based systems. So this is not really like the electric resistance type of systems we see in homes or buildings constructed in the 1970s. Heat pumps are extremely efficient. Even in our cold climate, they can achieve 200 to 300% efficiency on average. And so that allows them to be able to compete with gas alternatives in a way that electric resistance is maybe unable to. Next slide, please. One of the findings of our plan is around the significant equity and safety opportunities with electrification. So we found that around 30% of low-income homes we have worked in, their gas equipment fails carbon monoxide tests, and that's around 6 times the rate we see in market rate homes. And another data set shared with us from the Colorado Energy Office and the Energy Resource Center pegs this number at 42%. So 42% of low-income homes have gas equipment that is failing carbon monoxide tests, and 95% of low-income homes do not have a functioning carbon monoxide monitor. So there is significant health and safety opportunities in electrifying some of these end uses. Next slide, please. By and large, what our analysis found is that we can get the better outcomes for the same cost. So when a furnace or air conditioning compressor or a hot water heater fails, we found that most homes and buildings can replace it with an electric or partially electric equivalent, all for a similar cost for both installation and operation as they would have paid for a new gas system. And I'll dive into these details a little bit further. The results of our grid analysis are that Denver's electric system is actually already built to withstand really high air conditioning load during the summertime. So we have a lot of headroom to electrify winter heating loads that can continue to utilize renewable electricity without needing significant infrastructure build out at the system level. There might be some small like local distribution upgrades that are necessitated, but by and large, the grid can handle building electrification. Next slide. A little bit on heat pumps. We've been actually using them for over 100 years now in our refrigerators, and that's exactly how they work. So they move heat from one space to another, and so in our homes, they're able, or commercial buildings rather, they're able to provide both heating and cooling depending on the season. And heat pumps are really common for space and water heating in homes and buildings in Asia and Europe today. Next slide, please. There's our findings are that there are largely 4 space heating system types in commercial multifamily buildings. First and foremost, there's just standard furnaces. This is quite similar to what you might see in a single family home. And those have a number of options to be electrified, both fully electrified or partially, where we're retaining the gas furnace to provide heating for some of the coldest hours of the year, or installing a brand new hybrid system that is a packaged system that has both a heat pump and a furnace in it. The second system type that's quite common in Denver is rooftop units. You probably see these on top of buildings that are, say, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 stories tall. These also have a heat pump alternative, and that's right off the shelf. So when a rooftop unit is failing, it can be replaced with either a 100% electric heat pump rooftop unit, or again, a hybrid system where there's both a heat pump and a small gas unit in there. And the heat pump serves around 80% of the heating needs of the space, and that furnace kicks in for around 20% of those coldest hours. Next slide, please. The third and fourth space heating system types are PTACs and boilers. PTAC stands for packaged thermal air conditioners. This is what you're likely to see in hotels, for example, and might also appear in some multifamily housing. That the PTAC can actually be replaced by a PTHP, which stands for packaged thermal heat pump, that instead of just providing cooling, can also provide heating to the space as well. And in boilers, this is what we see in Denver's tallest buildings. These are central boilers that distribute the hot water and the heat to the rest of the building from one central location. The next slide, please. This is a very simplified slide. If you're curious about the actual numbers or percent figures or dollar figures, please feel free to look at the plan. But by and large, what our findings are that furnace or buildings that currently have furnaces or rooftop units are cost effective to electrify today. And in some cases, that'll be full electrification, where it is a heat pump with electric resistance backup. But in many cases, it's most cost effective to actually continue to utilize a hybrid system. So it's a heat pump based system for 80% of heating needs usually, and we're retaining some gas system there to support in the coldest hours. Our findings are also that PTACs, packaged thermal air conditioners, and boilers do not have an extremely cost-effective alternative today. There will be buildings that are able to do this cost effectively, if they're able to get creative with some engineering solutions. However, we are uncomfortable making the sweeping generalization that these systems can be electrified at no impact to building owner or building tenant costs. Next slide, please. Water heating system types, there are largely 3. Individual system with tanks. This is, again, likely what you would see in a single family home, but can often show up in commercial and multifamily buildings as well. Central system with tanks. This is what you might see in very large buildings, where again, you have one central system that's distributing hot water to the entire building. And then point of use, this is something you might see in say, an office bathroom, where there are heaters located right under the sink. Next slide, please. Our findings are that all 3 of these are largely cost effective to electrify today from a capital and operating cost. They have minimal impact to capital cost, and minimal impact to operating cost. One of the challenges, however, with central systems with tanks is that the technology doesn't seem to be widely available. So we don't feel comfortable, again, making a sweeping generalization that every building with a central system with tank, will be able to find an electric alternative today.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Now let's dive into the details of the Energize Denver Task Force. And I want to start just by covering what did the city charge the task force with, who was on the task force. We'll hear a few words from a couple of task force members, and then we'll walk through their draft recommendations. Again, nothing that we're going to present about their work today is final. Everything is still being figured out. We need your input. They need your input to finalize their recommendations. But they're really looking forward to having it and having that broad conversation with the community. Okay, so with that, let's dive in. The Energize Denver Task Force was charged by the city with helping us to design a building performance policy for existing buildings that improves health and equity, creates jobs, and drives climate solutions in buildings to bring existing buildings to net zero energy by 2040. They're focused on the existing commercial and multifamily buildings, not single family homes. And their net zero energy goal is defined by the city. This is the city's definition of net zero energy, that buildings are highly energy efficient, all electric, powered by renewable electricity, and providers of demand flexibility to the grid. Here's their goal in chart form. You can see 2020 on the left with the carbon emissions from electricity in blue and the fossil gas or natural gas carbon emissions in yellow. Their goals are the open bars to bring us down to zero emissions by 2040. So we set a cumulative emission reduction goal for the task force. And here's the task force membership. It was a really diverse group of individuals. They are a really diverse group of individuals representing building owners and managers, utility, our local utility, as well as energy producers, residents, tenants, nonprofits, labor, workforce training, environment and clean energy interests, as well as one member of Denver City Council. So with that here on this slide, I'd like to invite Stephen Shepard and Celeste Sizik to say just a few words, and I'll go ahead and call on Stephen to go first, just to share a little bit with all of the folks watching today around, what has really stood out to you in this task force process. What were some of your big takeaways? What do you want to share, and what can you really what do you hope to really get from our community through these input sessions? I think you're muted, Stephen.
You'd think we would have all learned that by now. So thanks, Katrina and Jan. This has been an incredible process to work through, and just, through all of these meetings, just to let everybody know, it's, everybody on this task force has been really engaged and really working towards trying to solve the challenges. I would say for me, the biggest takeaway and the biggest challenge, and one of the reasons why we need so much input, is there can't be a one size fits all solution. Every building is as unique as each of us are unique. And so, the space they have available and or the systems they currently have. And, there's all these other tenants that they have. There's all these things that kind of come into it. So how we can create a plan that helps get everyone there, but understanding that everybody's not going to be able to do the same path. And so we realize that we can't have an individual path for every building. But I think that we've done some great work to figure out how we might be able to give everyone opportunities to work with the city and make sure that they're successful in their own right. And so I think that that's, for me, the biggest piece that we need some more feedback on, based on what you guys are presenting today, where they see some of the challenges that they might see individually and or within their portfolios of properties as we kind of move through this process. And Celeste is the more technical one of the two of us. So she probably has some great information that's a little bit more along the lines of the technical. But I think that that's my biggest thing is we've got to do it. You know, we've done a pretty good job, I think, of setting it up for not a one size fits all process.
Yeah, and to follow on from that, I'd say some of my key takeaways. I think Denver is a leader in climate action, but we're also not the first. So I think it's been a good process to see what other cities have done, what has worked and what doesn't. And I think the task force has done a nice job of pulling together best practices, but also, as Stephen said, allowing those alternatives and different approaches for different building types in some ways that can allow for unique situations. I also think it's been a good exercise to really kind of balance the realities of to get to zero is pretty hard. And I think that there had to be some trade-offs of we are not recommending, for instance, that everybody rip out functioning natural gas equipment by 2030, which would be great for climate action. But I think the task force did a really nice job of kind of weighing in costs and realities of what's really feasible. So I do feel like we kind of got that in between of recommendations that are feasible and can reduce that cost burden. But I think that's a key feedback component of making sure that we can still have a viable, economic, thriving community while still meeting these goals.
Thank you both so much for chiming in and giving some of that context and feel for the task force process to everyone here. So let me just dive in and try in the next 30 minutes to really walk you through what was their process in more detail. How did they get to the draft set of recommendations you see today? And then we'll save 30 minutes just to answer those clarifying questions. Take comments if you really want to make them in this format versus filling out the survey and such. So we'll stay on for an additional 30 minutes, but I'll try to wrap up the briefing at that 1 hour mark for those who need to hop off. So do please feel free to take the survey. Also, you can look at the actual draft recommendations document. So Jan, if you can put both of those in the chat again for folks to review as we're going through this. Again, all these slides are also posted on the community engagement website. So here's the draft task force schedule. They started meeting in January and have been meeting every month. They spent a whole meeting just looking at equity and how to achieve racial equity and improve racial equity through their work. They reviewed other cities' approaches and then really dove in on energy efficiency and renewable electricity, followed by electrification and heating emission reductions. And then finally, they'll meet one last time on August 19th to really take all of your input into account, look at how it all comes together. So here were the things that they said at the start of the process. These came out of all the background interviews we did with every task force member, out of all of their initial discussions. And I think you heard Stephen and Celeste really reflect a lot of how much they focused on making this achievable for all buildings, fiscally attainable, flexible, as well as effective, and really affordable and implementable. And so they're really committed to achieving the ambitious goal set out for them, but also to getting something that really works for all building owners. This is the racial equity lens that they developed, that they spent all of their second meeting working on. And I think one of the big things that I took out of that discussion was that they really wanted to make sure they're using this lens, not like glasses they take off on and off, but more like LASIK. It's a different way that they're going to see their work and the world that their work is affecting, to make sure that the voice of people of color are present, and this is an accessible process, that the outcomes prioritize actually providing benefits and improving the lives of people of color, looking at how this will be perceived by people of color. And you'll see some of that in their implementation recommendations in particular, where we're going to do a lot of community outreach. And then really looking also at making sure that this policy doesn't worsen existing disparities. and really kind of breaking down what are the barriers to more equitable outcomes. How do we actually deliver equity benefits while delivering net zero energy buildings? They took this a step further in this racial equity roadmap, where they figured out how to apply the lens, which runs across everything, with really specific indicators and metrics for each part of their process. So the city brought them the question, how can net zero energy advance racial equity in Brown? And then as they got to each piece of their work, they really looked at, okay, so for renewable heating and cooling, to some of the slides Jan presented, how can we actually make sure we're improving housing quality and providing safer space with less carbon monoxide? How can we make sure housing cost increases and displacement are avoided? They had really specific indicators and metrics that they looked at in addition to that overall lens. So what have other cities done? They dove really deep into lots of detail on other cities. We had, a 1 hour briefing before every 3 hour task force meeting. But to give you a little taste of that, you can see in brown or orange here, the cities with building performance policies today, and then the blue are the cities with policies under development. Some of the models are here. Seattle requires tune-ups. St. Louis and Washington, D.C. require improvements in efficiency, whereas New York actually has carbon requirements. And they've learned a lot about what is working well with these other models and what is challenging by diving in deep to what's happening in other cities. They also were tracking what happened with the Colorado Energy Performance for Buildings bill really closely. The final bill is for buildings over 50,000 square feet, and the benchmarking in that bill starts in 2022 with 2021 data. And the state bill said that they will form a task force, and those applications I think are open right now, to develop performance standards to reach 7% savings by 2026 and 20% by 2030. And so this task force was keeping a really close eye on making sure they sync up with the state bill, but now the state bill a lot of the details will be decided by a task force later, and we'll continue to work to through that process to make sure that this is a coherent experience for building owners in Denver and with the state bill. The task force, we developed a policy design tool for the task force. This was done by Group 14 through a contract with the city to help the task force actually turn on and off different policy options to see if they're on or off track to meet their carbon budget, to meet those cost-effective tests and implementability tests and renewable goals and grid impacts. So it let them have inputs and outputs. And I'll just show you one screenshot, but this is a pretty big, complicated spreadsheet, but they could change the input, they could change the building size that's covered, they could change the energy reduction targets and they could change the target dates. They could set policies for small buildings or not. And you can see the output in terms of carbon impact on the right. And this is set currently to the recommendations I'm about to present. And you'll notice, their goal was to save 13.7 cumulative million tons of carbon dioxide by 2040. And they haven't met that goal with all the policies they're recommending today. I know they kind of got as far as they felt like was feasible and cost effective and implementable for buildings. They got to that 10.8, which is a lot of carbon saved. They're still looking at this to think about if there is a way to get closer to the goal. So again, that's a space where they want your input to see if they struck that correct balance between the ambition of the goal and the cost effectiveness and feasibility of some of what they're recommending. With that context, I'll dive in, spend a few minutes on energy efficiency and renewable energy and what their draft recommendations that are. And again, this is just draft recommendations at this point, nothing final. They considered quite a few options, and I won't go into too much depth, but you can kind of go read through all their meeting notes and all the options if you want. But they considered quite a few different policy options based off of the state bill, off of what other cities had recommended. And Currently, their recommendations are, the draft say that they are looking at a 30% improvement in energy performance by 2030 for all buildings over 25,000 square feet. They recommend that we set a performance target for each building type as measured through energy use intensity, which is energy use per square foot of the building. There would be required interim targets in 2024 and 2027 set for every building by drawing a straight line from that building's baseline in 2019 to that building type's target in 2030. And solar would be fully credited towards energy use, directly lowering the building's net energy use intensity. 15% of buildings, I will note, have already met the performance target for all the building types. So they wouldn't have to do anything except maintain that performance. Here's what that looks like in graph form. Here's 3 different office buildings. All 3 of them are not yet at the final performance target of energy use intensity of 50 kBTUs per square foot. Office A uses the most energy today and has the farthest to go in its improvements. Some other cities have set the same interim targets for all buildings. And this is more of a trajectory approach. Montgomery County, Maryland is also considering this approach because it doesn't kind of throw Office A off a cliff of having to get all the way to 70, but or something like that, right? Where they have to go really far, really fast. They get their own trajectory with binding interim targets set for that building. Office B has a different trajectory, and Office C just has to improve a little bit for each target to reach that final goal. You can see different targets will be set for different building types. So 50 is the target for an office, so that all offices on average save 30%. Here are those 2030 target energy use intensities, or energy use per square foot, where lower is more efficient, right? For different building types, you can see a medical office is going to use more energy than an office, and so has a higher target. A hotel has a somewhat higher target. A self-storage facility doesn't use very much energy, and so has a lower target. Same for warehouses or distribution centers, whereas grocery stores use a lot of energy with all those refrigerators, and so they have a higher target. This still gets 30% savings across all grocery stores by 2030 if they all hit that number. Here's how the sort of have a 3-year compliance cycle. I won't go through this in a ton of detail. It's explained in the recommendations, but basically in 2022, we'll communicate all of the requirements. 2023, initial improvements need to be complete because 2024 is actually the interim compliance year. The data for that calendar year is what will count for compliance. And so then in 2025, that report will come in for 2024 calendar year energy usage to see if the building has saved the required amount of energy. And I'm going to go now into some, because you're probably thinking, what if they don't hit it? So now I'm going to go into some of the alternate compliance options. It was really important, as you heard, to the task force to make sure this is achievable for all buildings. And the first alternate for a building that can't hit that timeline would be to request a different compliance timeline. And there'll be a bunch of reasons why that might be needed. Sometimes you're going to wait for end of system life, or if you're going to do a major renovation in 2025, it doesn't make sense to make a whole bunch of changes in 2023, possibly 2024. If a major tenant is about to move out, they'd have to include the reason for the delay and a plan for achieving that same end goal and the next interim target in the future. And proof that really easy items and cost-effective items like a lighting upgrade have been completed. Some of those are going to have a really quick return. And again, where that makes sense. If they're about to sort of gut the building and go through a major renovation, maybe that's not necessary, but in other cases, there's really easy things that should just be done right away. So alternate compliance option 2 would actually be to adjust the end goal, because as Stephen said, buildings are all different. There could be some inherent characteristics of a building that make hitting this target really hard. Generally, statistically, sort of speaking, like all of the buildings, each building type performs similarly according to the EPA analysis and sort of type setting by buildings. But if there's an inherent characteristic of the building or a big change in the way the building is used, there would be a standard process to actually adjust the end goal for that building. There would also be a prescriptive option just for those smaller buildings who might have less sophistication around managing to a certain kBTU per square foot. If they electrify space and water heat, at least partially, and verify they have all LED lights, then that should get them most of the way to what a 2024 or 2027 goal is. And electrifying space and water heat, it usually lowers energy use 25 to 30%. And so if they take those steps, then they would be in compliance for 2024 and 2027. And they would just have to meet that final 2030 target. And then manufacturing and agriculture would have a separate compliance option also, because the metric for them should be energy use per thing they produce, because they use energy to produce things. It's a different sort of metric. One option would be to use Energy Star performance indicators for plants, but the details for this option would be developed with manufacturing and agricultural stakeholders to achieve the same goal. The penalties would need to be higher than the cost for compliance, and higher for a building that has an alternate compliance timeline. If they're going to delay, then they really have to meet that next target, and that needs to be really clear. And we'll explore mechanisms to make sure that if a building is sold, the new owner understands the compliance status and obligation. Okay, with that, let's turn and go through the renewable heating and cooling policy options. And Jan, I think we might, just in the interest of time, Jan's going to present these, go just right into what they're recommending, or touch only briefly on sort of the options they considered.
Sure thing, Katrina. Yeah, just a brief overview of the options considered. There's a lot of text on this slide, but by and large, it was sort of three options. The first was a full electrification, really ambitious proposal. The third was a partial electrification of systems that do have capital and operating cost parity, assuming the city can provide some incentives to support that, some of these projects. And then the third was sort of the least ambitious policy that doesn't really necessitate many incentives and is just looking at end of life equipment replacements for only cost-effective systems. And all of these proposals were only for end of life systems. Next slide, please. The thought process of the task force around what building electrification and reducing heating emissions in Denver should look like is it's kind of three different steps. The first step is to have the city incentivize electrification schematic designs and costing. So this is where the city would pay building owners to look at their electrification options and engage with an engineering firm to understand, what does a heat pump look like in my building? The second step is to make sure that permitting is equally easy for both gas and heat pump based systems. So today it's a little bit more complicated to permit a heat pump. So we want to just level the playing field so that everyone has the same access to through the permitting system. And at that point in time, the plan would be for the city to provide incentives for heat pumps for all buildings. So any building in Denver would be a commercial multifamily building would be eligible for incentives for a heat pump project. And the third step is to really start to require heat pumps. So, and this is only an end of life replacement. So when a system is failed or about to fail, that's when we would require a heat pump. And at that point in time, once those requirements go into place, our incentives would shift to supporting only those under-resourced buildings. Next slide, please. So the current draft proposal from the task force is sort of split up into two categories. These four system types, the gas furnaces, the rooftop units, the individual system of tanks, and the gas point of use, you will remember are four of the most cost-effective system types that have minimal impact to capital and operating cost. And so for these system types, starting in 2022, we'd like to offer incentives to pay for electrification schematic designs. In 2023, we would provide incentives for heat pump replacements for any building that is pursuing that project. And we would level that playing field in the permitting process. And then in 2025, the plan would be to start to require heat pumps as the primary source of heating. And what that means is that the heat pump is providing 50 to 80% of the heating needs for the space, and either electric resistance or a fossil gas backup system is allowed to provide sort of that backup for those coldest hours of the year, depending on what is best for that building type. And at that point in time, given that it's a requirement, our incentives, again, would shift to only supporting the under-resourced buildings. Next slide, please. The second set of technologies, PTACs, packaged thermal air conditioners, central boilers, and central systems with tanks for water heating, you may recall are three of the ones that aren't as cost-effective quite yet. So we'd still like to provide incentives and supports for buildings to implement electrification strategies for this system types. And you'll see that reflected in that in 2023, we again would like to start paying for electrification schematic designs. In 2024, we want to start providing incentives for these projects for any building that would like to pursue it. And then in 2025, we would level the playing field for permitting. And in 2027, rather than outright requiring heat pumps as the primary source of heating like we did for the other four system types, the intent would be to revisit the cost test and understand, have the efficiencies improved, have costs come down, have the economics in general change? And if so, we would start requiring heat pumps as the primary heating source for packaged thermal air conditioner replacements. And for boilers and central systems, we would like to pursue a strategy where we would start to require partial electrification. So a heat pump would be the primary source of heating again, and some fossil gas-based systems would be allowed for backup needs. And again, if those requirements were to go into law, those incentives would shift to supporting only under-resourced buildings in order to meet those requirements. And finally, one of the definitions of net zero for us is around demand flexibility. And one of the lowest cost opportunities we see for that is around electrifying water heating and requiring that those electric water heaters utilize an open source standard called the ANSI CTA 2045. And really, this is just a demand response protocol where, and it's already being used by Xcel Energy with heat pump water heaters in the residential space, where a utility such as Xcel Energy is able to call on those water heaters to shift their usage throughout the day. So maybe preheat some water in the middle of the night when not as much energy is being used, or vice versa, whatever the arrangement might be. And obviously a commercial building can always override that, but this is one way where we can mitigate grid impacts and align the actual usage of electricity with when renewables are available. Katrina,
Thanks, Jan. I was muted. I'll walk you now through the support and incentives, as well as the implementation recommendations of the task force. And again, I'll aim to finish by the top of the hour, and then we can take questions or have any discussion if you wish. So go ahead and do keep giving us questions, either in the chat to the panelists or in the Q&A feature in Zoom. So first, the task force recommends that we provide significant support to buildings to help them comply through an individual performance portal, web resources, how-to guides, checklists, a lot of targeted outreach and education. We'll have a call center where they can call to get technical assistance. They can learn about financing options to help pay for projects. And we would do a lot of community engagement and provide recognition for those who are leading. Here's an example of the building performance hub that Washington, D.C. has. If you want to see what this might look like, you could go to this link, buildinginnovationhub.org. They just have a lot of great resources available to help building owners comply. We would also provide extra support for under-resourced buildings, and we'll identify those buildings through a social equity index, where we look at weighted social equity indicators to identify which areas of the city are likely to have the most under-resourced buildings in them. So we actually have a question for you in the survey that we're have open right now, that's in the chat, where you can help us weight which of these indicators you think that we should really prioritize in creating this social equity index. There would be, for all of the incentives, sort of a phasing, and you heard this from Jan in the electrification recommendations. First, we would incentivize early action for all buildings with a goal of having 50% of incentives go to under-resourced buildings. And these will really be focused, the incentives will be focused on electrification, because that's where, while a lot of the things the task force has recommended are near cost parity, there may still be a slightly higher cost. And so phase 2 is really going to target the incentives to help under-resourced buildings with compliance, so that all under-resourced buildings have support once requirements are in place at end of system life. And then finally, the incentives would phase out when cost parity is achieved, either with or possibly without utility incentives. And we'd advocate for incentives from others and match in city incentives to those, so that we hopefully don't have to sort of foot all of this bill with city dollars. And then, as I said, those under-resourced buildings that we identify through the social equity index, but also through an application process, would get additional technical assistance. And this is more than just sort of a call center that they could call to for support. They would get one-on-one consultative services, someone to really do their energy assessment and walk them through their options, as well as additional financial assistance through sort of additional incentives and possibly additional project funding, sort of as needed with verification. And the goal of this would be to make sure that our incentive programs and our support for these under-resourced buildings achieves energy cost reductions for low-income residents, protection against rent increases for low-income residents to the extent feasible, and improved health outcomes and lower health costs through these improvements to buildings. And there was a whole workforce work group of the task force, and they said that we should make sure city incentive dollars support women and minority owned businesses and high road jobs. So that in city incentive dollars to sort of offer and be a contractor offering and utilizing those incentive dollars, they would need to demonstrate that they are the contractor, that they're a women and minority owned business, and or have a commitment to these high road labor standards. And the task force recommends kind of a process to figure out a lot of these details to make sure city money is promoting these two goals. The task force also recommended a number of their recommendations in their draft again, so they need all of your input. Their recommendations include workforce training recommendations, that the city do outreach and education to give under-resourced communities equitable access to these new jobs, as well as create a pipeline for entry-level workers and upskilling of current workers. And through training programs and pathways. And there's a lot of this work already going on out there. So one of the key task force recommendations is that we do the research to make sure what we're offering fits with the larger workforce training landscape. So with that, I'll kind of walk you through, again, the overall timeline. Blue are the energy efficiency requirements. You can see the interim targets in 2024 and 2027, as well as the final target in 2030. And then there's sort of two phases for the renewable heating and cooling requirement. In 2025, requirements start for those more cost-effective, easy to electrify systems. And in 2027, they start for the harder to electrify systems as feasible and cost-effective. Implementation. There's a number of implementation recommendations. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here, but you can read all the details in the task force recommendation. They have a lot of recommendations about equitable implementation. They have recommend a technical advisory committee to have an ongoing role in overseeing ordinance design, as well as every 4 or 5 years, do a larger review of the compliance options with similar representation as the task force itself in terms of categories that need to be represented. It wouldn't necessarily be the same individuals. There would be a whole application process, a new process to apply for this. So if you are interested in getting involved, if this all passes into a law, you should watch for the opportunity, and we'll send this out to our list to apply. And then they recommend that some city staffing levels, because it was really important to the task force that we have enough staff and resources to implement this effectively. So with that, please take the survey. It's in the chat. Tell the task force what you think. And with that, we'll wrap up sort of the briefing, but we are happy to stay on. We'll be here another half an hour, and we'll go through answering the questions that we've seen. And Jan, I know you've been looking at the questions. Do you want to just read them, since others I don't think can all read them, and then we'll answer, and we can tag team answering them, but then everyone will hear what the question is.
Yeah, sure thing. So the first question is from Kevin Matthews. He asks, why are single family homes exempt from this? Multi-unit buildings on a per person basis are already more efficient from an energy efficiency standpoint. Considering the number of single unit detached houses we have in the city, it seems like we're letting the largest emitters slide.
Thank you for the question, Kevin. Single family homes are responsible for 15% of greenhouse gas emissions in Denver. That is compared to 49% for commercial and multifamily buildings. So they are a smaller source of emissions. And the reason they're not included here is because regulating single family homes is just a very different thing to do than regulating a business with professional management. It's something that we want to work towards reducing emissions in single family homes. We plan to start using some climate protection fund dollars to incentivize single family homes to electrify and improve their energy efficiency. But that's just a separate body of work to work with. There's 130 or 140,000 homes in Denver, and they're these are just owned by residents, unlike sort of the buildings, which is a smaller number, and their investment properties, or they're professionally managed, or it's someone's job to sort of own and manage that building. So it would just be a separate process. It's not that we don't want to work on single family homes, it just wasn't appropriate to group together with this policy process.
Thanks, Katrina. Lots of questions from Matthew Dalhausen. If emissions is ultimately the goal, why pick an EOI target rather than an emissions target?
Great question. It is hard to regulate emissions at a building level. So because there's a number of reasons for that, but emissions from the electricity used in buildings vary on an hourly basis, or a minute by minute basis. The emissions are not constant. So there's, and you could use an average emissions factor for the grid, but that is not necessarily super accurate. Emissions matter hour by hour. And so it's very hard to measure and track an accurate emissions target. Whereas we know that it's also just not a metric that building owners are familiar with. They're not like billed in terms of emissions on their utility bill. Whereas they understand that energy usage. And so we want to make the target achievable and understandable for building owners and to have it be something that can actually be measured. So you can actually accurately measure the emissions sort of minute by minute in buildings today. So the EUI target is designed to hit the emissions goal, but we didn't want to use emissions with building owners for all those reasons.
Thanks. A few more from Matthew. How is building energy use and floor area verified? Are you assuming people are entering data in Energy Star Portfolio Manager accurately? And how do you handle the year-to-year weather dependence of EUI?
Yeah, so energy use intensity, I'll start with the weather dependence question. It is weather normalized every year when it's given to the city through the EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool. We've been running benchmarking for 5 years now where we get these annual energy performance reports from all buildings. We run over 30 data quality checks on all of those reports. And we make them fix the report if we see any errors in the data, if there's a strange sort of jump up or down in energy usage, or there's a lot of different things. And you can look at our benchmarking website for the full list of all the data quality checks we run. We think that generally the data is pretty good and pretty accurate that we're getting through benchmarking. And I think that would continue through this.
Thanks. And another EUI question. How do you determine EUI for mixed use buildings?
Energy use intensity for mixed use buildings. We are given the data where there's multiple primary uses of a building. We get that reported through benchmarking, and we would just set a target for a mixed use building. But if there's a small extra use, say a call center in 10% of the office building, that might not be reported to us as a separate use type through benchmarking today. If it's a major second use, say half office, half multifamily, we know that already. If there's a small second use, we may not know that in our current benchmarking data. And that is why we will have this process to adjust the end target if there is some need for a building to do that based off of a change in use or a special small use or inherent characteristic of the building.
Thanks. A question here from Matthew that I'm happy to take around energy resiliency and backup energy in terms of a grid outage, things like that. One of the common misconceptions around gas equipment is that it can continue to provide space or water heating in the event of an electric outage. So you still need electricity to run the fans or pumps to distribute that hot air or hot water in the space. And we're also not planning or not looking to whatsoever regulate backup energy needs. So hospitals and other critical facilities that have diesel generators on site, that's not within the scope of this policy. Question about new buildings. I don't know if you want to take that kind of a passive design if you want. Why not push more passive design new building code instead of relying on electrification, decarbonize new buildings?
So we weren't presenting at all here today on our work in new buildings. I'd encourage anyone interested in new buildings to get involved in the code update process. We're accepting applications for the code committees for new buildings right now. Those are open through October. I believe the code committees will start meeting in January to consider how to take the next step in the building code towards our goal for net zero energy new buildings. And I think those code committees are likely to be considering lots of efficiency improvements as well as electrification, as well as how to do more renewables and how to look at embodied carbon. But that just wasn't the focus for this presentation today. This is just on the existing building policy process.
Thanks, Katrina. Robbie Schwartz asks, what happens if the building department can't pass the codes to make the CAP attainable?
I'm not sure, Robbie, and maybe you can add in the chat a clarifying question if I don't answer your question, but I think that you are wondering what if a new building can't hit these targets. I think these targets should be easily achieved by new buildings, even under today's code. The targets we will set for each building type are based off of the 2019 benchmarking data for all existing buildings. And like I said, 15% of existing buildings, which were built under old codes, are already more efficient than the target that would be set for every building type. So this is just bringing the other 85% up to the performance level of that top 15% today. New buildings that are coming out, even under today's code, I think this should be relatively easy for them to hit.
And I missed one from Matthew Dalhousen. What happens if Excel misses their decarbonization goal? Does Denver give up on its goal too?
We're working really closely in partnership with Excel on all of this. I think we fully expect that they have plans in place and their approved plans by the PUC to reach their goals. And they have laid out how they're going to get to 80% renewable by 2030. They've set that goal to be carbon free by 2050. We fully expect that they will hit those. We are trying to work to fill that gap. And should that gap get bigger, we'll work to fill a bigger gap. But I don't expect that to be the case. We do have a goal. I say a gap because we have a goal as a city to be 100% renewable by 2030. And so we are working to get more renewables built in Denver. We measure that goal through renewable capacity installed.
Great. A couple of questions from Jeff Newman Lee. For single family homes, why not put an end to natural gas replacement of hot water? And why not rectify permitting difficulty immediately? Seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah, I think that the task force, I'll take the second one first again. In terms of permitting difficulty, the task force recommends that happen in 2023, and that is immediately in city timeline. That's about as fast as we move on changes to permitting processes. And so we are working very quickly already towards figuring out how that would work. For single family homes, it just wasn't the focus area for this task force. And so that would be, it's just a separate question. We're just focused on commercial and multifamily buildings. I think it would be a very separate set of stakeholders that we would engage to think about what to do with single family homes. It's our community that gets to decide policy. That's why this task force is representative of our community. And we just didn't have the single family home community here. Let me close my windows because there's a one more.
Okay. We have one more question. So we'll take this last one, and I'll put the survey link in the chat just to make sure everyone has had it. I know we've sent it several times, but we'd love for you to fill that out. Tell us what your impressions are, what you learned today, and some strategies around filling some of the gaps, or what else the city should be doing around under-resourced buildings and communities. The final question from Nate Edge is, how will workforce development be incentivized for this plan? Are there workforce development models in other areas of the country that demonstrate best practices for these areas of employment?
Thanks, Nate. Great question. There is a whole workforce training section of this plan, and it includes both making sure we promote access to all of these jobs for under-resourced communities and for women and minority-owned businesses to get into this work. And then also there's a whole section on how we do training or how we should do training for bringing new workers into this space. There's a real shortage of workers with an expertise in heating and cooling systems and ventilation systems today. And so how do we build the pipeline of workers with a focus on giving opportunities to under-resourced communities? And then also how do we upskill current workers? And if you have recommendations, like I would say read that one page within the task force recommendations. It's towards the end. And if you have specifics that you think they should add in from models in other areas and best practices, that would be most welcome. The task force and the workforce work group did review some best practices from other areas. They also, like many things in the task force recommendation, they recommend that we go through a process to develop even more detail. So the task force is getting to a certain level of detail and setting principles and priorities, and then we will have to go do more work with our community to actually build a workforce training program and do more planning around that and do more looking at those best practices. So thank you for the suggestion. If you think there's more things they should put in those kind of principles and priorities directing the city what to do, please tell us, but also know there will be a subsequent process to shape like what is that whole workforce training program.
Thanks, Katrina. That's all the questions I see.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. Please take the survey to give the task force your feedback on their work. It sounds like we have a lot of really great technical experts here from the kinds of questions you're asking, which is fantastic. In whether technical or not, give them your thoughts. But if you have things where you want to dive into the weeds on, certain edits, please, or certain ideas, please do that. We'll, be compiling all of that for them and updating their recommendations with some options or ideas for inclusion next week. So take the survey. The survey is open through tomorrow. So please do it today or do it tomorrow. And then we will pass all of that along to them and work to help them incorporate all of your ideas into their recommendations. So thanks again. Okay, bye everyone. I'll let you get on with your day.